Protea Prime just released, and I gotta say, Protea is the perfect Warframe. She can blast everything, survive everything, lock down whole rooms, all while at the same time never ever running out of energy. So, in today's Warframe guide, I'm not only going to show you how you can recreate this incredibly busted Protea build right here, but I also have a cheaper budget option and a very underrated alternative way to play her that you just must try out for yourselves. As always, big shoutouts to all my generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, let's jump right into it. Alright, so you know the drill. When we're talking about Warframes, the first topic is always the skills, starting out with Protea's passive, and this one is really nice. What it does is, every 4th skill that you cast gets plus 100% ability strength. So if you have something that you don't want to recast every 3 seconds, then you might want to try juggle your skills in a way to make sure that this ability that you want to have the most strength on will be your 4th, so you benefit from that big bonus. And that's already it. Her first ability, Grenade Fan, has 2 modes. If you tap the skill, she throws forward a handful of grenades that create a sort of AoE in which they deal slash damage to all enemies that come too close and also lock them in a stagger animation as long as they're in this force field. Now, in terms of the damage that they deal, they really don't look all too impressive, but I promise you, this skill is severely underrated, and we're gonna get back to it here in just a couple of minutes. As for the other thing that this skill can do, if you hold the button to cast it, then you will throw out a different bunch of grenades which attach to you and allies when you get close, and then they orbit around you while constantly restoring your shields. This is extremely amazing, and it helps Protea and her allies stay alive, because not only does it regenerate your shields, it also does so while you're actively taking damage, so there's no shield recharge delay here. Skill number 2 is Protea's bread and butter, her big signature, and that would be of course her Blaze Artillery. When you tap it, Protea puts up these auto turrets mid-air that are just floating around there and attack enemies in range. What I should say though is that they don't have a 360 AoE, they can only attack in a certain cone in front of them, so you need to make sure that they're facing the right direction. Also, at the same time, you can have up to 3 of these bad boys in the air at any given moment. Now, in and of itself, the damage that they deal is not all too impressive, and also the duration is pretty short. However, they have a mechanic that makes them very, very strong. And that is, for every enemy they hit, they get a certain multiplier. And the higher this multiplier is, the more damage each consecutive shot will deal. Keep this one in mind, because the scaling potential on it is absolutely out of this world. Then, on to skill number 3, which is also super important for her kit. It goes by the name Dispensary, and this one is basically your infinite source of energy. What happens when you tap the skill is, Protea puts down this Dispensary, and this one then spits out different types of consumables in a regular interval. It can give you energy orbs, universal ammo pickups, and special big health orbs that don't just regenerate 25, but 100 health each. Just one thing to keep in mind here is, if you don't pick up the stuff that it spit out before, it will not create the same thing again, so you need to pick it up first and then you will get another one. Now, for Dispensary, there's also an augment mod. However, I don't want to get all too much into the details of this one because we're not going to use it today, and I personally also think it's not too useful in general. So let's move on to skill number 4, which goes by the name Temporal Anchor, or as some others might call it, cheers love, the cavalry's here! Alright, now that was pretty cringe now, wasn't it? Anyway, this skill is basically Tracer from Overwatch. Once you tap it, Protea will sort of record her current position in the room for a couple of seconds, and then once the timer runs out, she will go back in time along this path while reloading her weapon and also dealing some damage. Now, I'm fully aware of the fact that I skipped over a lot of the mechanics of this skill right here, but the reason is, I personally think it's just really not that useful, and if you want to helmet anything else onto Protea, this would be the one to sacrifice. It also has an augment, which in and of itself is actually not all too bad, because what it does is, while you're in this recording phase, every hit that you will deal with your first ability, the Grenade Fan, and the second ability, the Blaze Artillery, those hits will strip away armor from the enemies. So that's pretty good. However, as we will see, it's also not really needed on today's builds, so let's not waste any further time on Temporal Anchor. Alright, so much for the skills, let's go on to the builds now. And today, the first thing I want to talk about is actually the Archon shards already. See, Protea is a frame that casts a lot of skills, and ideally you want to have that casting animation sped up a bit. So the first thing I did is add 2 yellow Archon shards to give me more casting speed. By the way, having even more casting speed would even be better, so if you have Tau Forged yellows, then you can definitely consider using them. Then another problem with Protea is that she wants a ton of stuff modded onto her. That's why I decided to use 3 blue Archon shards to give me more maximum energy, effectively freeing up one mod slot that otherwise would have gone to a flow mod. In case of the blue shards, however, I wouldn't recommend going for the Tau ones because I feel having plus 150 energy from 3 normal ones is more than enough for Protea, and I never saw myself running low. And of course, if you haven't unlocked Archon shards just yet, or you simply don't want to invest all that much into her, it's completely fine. While yes, she does benefit from Archon shards, Protea definitely doesn't need them to be good, and we're also gonna see that. And just by the way, if you like the video, then the YouTube algorithm will like me, and that would make me very happy, so big cheers for your awesome support. But now, let's go on with the build. Alright, so the first build that we're going to talk about today is the classic Protea that we all know and all love, going mainly for her Blaze Artillery, trying to make that as strong as possible. And because Blaze Artillery is a relatively complex skill, before we get into the modding of Protea herself, we actually need to talk about some mechanics in the game that are absolutely essential to make this whole thing work, and it's crucial that you understand them before building your Protea yourself. And the first mechanic on this list would be Heat Inherit. Never heard of it? Well, no problem. See, as you probably know, in Warframe when you're dealing damage over time effects, then each and every individual DOT proc has its own duration. Meaning if you start shooting an enemy with slash, then you will see the number of slash procs building up, and then once you stop shooting, it will gradually go down to 0 again. However, if you're dealing damage over time using heat status effects, then it is different. Because for heat, unlike other DOT elements, the duration of every previous heat status effect on the enemy will be refreshed, meaning it is theoretically possible to have infinite heat procs on an enemy. And this very unique mechanic leads to quite some interesting shenanigans. What it does is, the first heat status effect that you apply to any given enemy will take its heat damage bonus, faction damage bonus, and status duration, and pass it on to every subsequent heat effect that is being dealt to that enemy, regardless if those other heat procs even have those stats or not. Just to make an example, Protea's Blaze Artillery does heat damage. However, it is a Warframe skill and not a weapon, so you cannot go and mod the Blaze Artillery itself. However, what you can do is take a weapon, put heat damage bonus, faction damage bonus, and if you want to, status duration onto the weapon, inflict one heat status effect with that weapon, and then use the Blaze Artillery, and each and every heat status effect dealt by the Blaze Artillery afterwards will be treated as if it had the same amount of heat damage bonus, faction damage bonus, and status duration modded onto itself. As you also see in the background, there is a drastical difference in power with and without Heat Inherit. As to which weapon we want to use for the Heat Inherit, most people actually recommend using a secondary weapon because secondary weapons have access to the mod Primed Heated Charge, therefore theoretically being able to have the most amount of modded heat damage bonus out of all weapon classes. And if you want to go for a secondary weapon, then I would recommend the Kuva Nukor, the Atomos, or the Epitaph, bonus points if you have a Riven for them. However, I personally didn't go for a secondary weapon and instead used the Proboscis Cernos. While yes, it is true, the Proboscis Cernos being a primary cannot have that much modded heat damage bonus on it, it has this great feature where it doesn't only apply viral, but also neatly groups up enemies, which leads us over to the next mechanic that is essential for Protea's Blaze Artillery, and that is grouping up your enemies. See, as I said in the beginning, each and every Blaze Artillery has this little damage multiplier on it, and whenever it hits an enemy, the damage will scale up. Now, here is the thing. The hits of the Blaze Artillery have a little bit of an AoE, so if you group enemies tightly together, then one shot from the Blaze Artillery can easily hit multiple enemies at the same time, therefore also increasing the multiplier by multiples per shot. This way, the damage scaling of the Blaze Artillery absolutely goes through the roof, so grouping enemies together is very important. Now, about the grouping, you of course don't have to use the Proboscis Cernos like I do. There are so many ways in the game how to group enemies. For example, you could go and use a helmet skill, like Korra's and Snare, Or what many players will probably also like is using Nautilus as your companion, because with its mod Cordon, it automatically goes and groups up enemies together. In my personal testing, I gotta say I didn't like the performance of Nautilus because the Sentinel kinda has a mind of its own and you yourself cannot control when the grouping happens, where the grouping happens, and which enemies are gonna be grouped in which spot. I personally just found it too inconsistent, but you can definitely go and try it for yourself. So yeah, these two mechanics, heat inherent and enemy grouping, are essential to keep in mind when you wanna have a strong Protea. But now that we know that, time to finally jump into the build. First of all, one mod that is essential to make the Blaze Artillery really strong would be Archon Vitality. Here, we don't really care about the health, but about the additional bonus, which doubles heat status effects inflicted by abilities, making it that each shot from the Blaze Artillery actually deals 2 heat status effects instead of 1. Then, in the aura, I went for Growing Power, giving us a little bit more ability strength, but you can certainly use whatever you like. Prime Surefooted in the Excellent slot, and then I modded for a whole lot of range with Overextended and Stretch. Why did I do this? Well, because as a helmet ability with this build, I personally use Thero Strike from Styanax, and this one is just amazing with a lot of range. The reason why I'm using this is because you lose a lot of the heat damage of the Blaze Artillery through enemy armor, and when you're fighting Corpus, also shields are relatively strong against heat, and Thero Strike is a quick and easy, universally usable way to get rid of armor and shields at the same time. Then, to make sure that we have at least 200% ability strength so that Thero Strike can even full strip in the first place, I added Umbral Intensify, Blind Rage, and Mold Augmented. After a couple of kills, you will reach that 200% threshold. Prime Continuity and Mold Efficiency just to have a bit more duration and keep the skills on for longer. Adaptation for the survivability, because while the shield recharge from her first skill is definitely nice, it is not enough to out-heal the damage coming in Steel Path, so adaptation really helps. And finally, to always have infinite amounts of energy, we use Equilibrium. Remember, the health orbs from Protea's dispensary heal 100 health each, meaning with Equilibrium, each and every one of those gives you 110 energy, not just 25 as the normal health orbs. This right here would be the full build, and one thing I wanted to add is that if you happen to struggle surviving with this one, then you can very well go and sacrifice Thero Strike and use Mirage's Eclipse via the helmet instead, giving you another fat 75% damage reduction on top of adaptation, so with that one, you're basically unscratchable. So yeah, that's pretty much the classic build approach for Protea, and it is very strong but also quite a bit expensive, and I can totally understand if you don't want to go for all the 4-man Prime mods required for this. So this right here is a more budget-friendly approach of that build. Sure, it is not as strong, but it doesn't use any helmet ability, it doesn't use an Excellence mod, it doesn't use any arcanes, no Prime mods, it doesn't need Archon shards, and it is really easy to come by. Just one tip on the side, if you use Aerodynamic in the Aura and potentially Aviator in the Excellence mod slot, then whenever you feel your shields are getting a bit low, just jump into the air, then you get that damage reduction, therefore your little shield drone orbiting you has an easier time regenerating all the shields that you've lost. Alright, so much for the classical way of playing Protea with the Blaze Artillery. However, in the intro, I promised you to have a super strong, very underrated alternative way to play her, so let's talk about this right now. The build I'm about to show you now is not focused on the Blaze Artillery, but solely on her first skill, you know, those little grenades that have the slash AoE. When I showcased them in the beginning of the video, they were really not that strong. However, we can certainly make them. Since they deal slash damage and also inflict bleed effects, what we're going to do in this one is use Rhino's Roar as a helmet ability that gives us universal faction damage bonus, therefore all those bleed effects will double dip and deal way more damage. And also, as we all know, bleed effects naturally ignore armor, so no matter how thick and tanky the opponents are, it's gonna slice through them like a hot knife through butter. Now, of course, since we want to make sure to have as much damage with those as possible, we need to mod for a whole lot of ability strength. That's why I went for Umbral Intensify, Blind Rage, Mold Augmented, as well as Augur Secrets and Growing Power in the Aura. Then, another thing that is incredibly important here is also to have a decent amount of range, because we want to make sure that the AoE in which they slash the enemies is as big as possible so we get a lot of crowd control out of them. That's why I added Overextended and Stretch. See, the great thing about this build is we can spam those grenades like there's no tomorrow, because they're cheap and they're quick to cast. And the more grenades we have, the more slashes we inflict, the more damage we deal, and that will tick down even the strongest enemies really quickly. And what's more is that every enemy that gets into this AoE will be permanently staggered and stun locked until they're not in the AoE anymore. This might not sound all too impressive on paper, but as you also see in the background, this can easily enable you to lock down entire rooms where no enemy can even get close to a certain defense target that you're trying to protect, which, as we all know, can be a bit challenging if you're doing it in Steel Path solo. With Protea, however, this is absolutely no problem. In my testing, I ran multiple defense, mobile defense, excavation missions, and at no point did any enemy even get close to the target. You just need to make sure that you pick off Eximus units. This right here would be the full build, and I really want to encourage you to try it for yourself because it is a ton of fun and makes solo defense missions extremely easy. But as we know, no good Warframe loadout will be complete without a good companion. So let's now also quickly go over the best companion options for your personal Protea. Since she is already so versatile and brings so much to the table, companions are not that important with her than with many other frames. I personally found that the Panzerwalpephyla synergizes extremely well with her because, as we all know, it applies tons of viral to the entire room, which comes in very handy because that means the enemies take even more damage. This right here would be the build that I'm running on my Panzer. But if you don't want to go for the Walpephyla and you don't want to group the enemies with the Proboscis Cernos like I do, then you can of course try the Nautilus Sentinel for yourself, see if the cordon grouping works better for you than it did for me. This right here would be the loadout that I used in my testing. And beyond those two, every other companion sure is nice to have, but I don't see any great synergies. So feel free to do some testing on your own. And if you now want to know how to also never die with any other Warframe, then don't miss this guide right here. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Lycan Shepherd, Turtlebeer, Shadow Soul, JPT Kochman, Pepperwolf, Ondakani02, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.